Done.
Chitra, can we start?
Yes, yes.
Namaste. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this 20th session of Literary and Cultural Forum lectures, which we have been having over the past 1.5 years. We have had many eminent people joining us. And Dr. Jamila is the director of the Literary and Cultural Forum. She is away in US, so just 1 minute. Please give me a minute.
She's just joined.
Yeah, Jamila has joined.
No, but our case is midnight, I think. So she must have.
So she's away, and so we have been carrying on this series. All India Women's Conference, most of you are members, but there are a few who are not members. So I'll just very briefly tell something about All India Women's Conference. All India Women's Conference, established in 1927, is one of the oldest national women's organizations in India. And the history of AWC runs parallel to the history of the women's movement in India, because all prominent women who were involved in the freedom struggle and in the women's movement have all been members and office bearers of All India Women's Conference. And very significant connections are there with the national movement. Just to give a few examples, one is that now we are all going to hoist the Tiranga, the national flag, in our homes in a couple of days, because on August 15th, Independence Day, we have been asked to do that. The national flag was presented to the President Rajendra Prasad at the first session of Indian Parliament, just after the famous Tryst with Destiny speech of Jawaharlal Nehru. Dr. Hansa Mehta presented the flag to Dr. Rajendra Prasad and said that the flag of India is a gift of the women of India to the nation. And Hansa Mehta was the president of All India Women's Conference and a member of the flag committee. There were 80 members, and almost 80 to 85% of them were All India Women's Conference members. So that is our proud association with the national flag. And again, the national anthem. Margaret Cousins, who was one of the founders of AWC, has given in her autobiography. She has described how Rabindranath Tagore visited the school where she and her husband James Cousins were teaching. They were very closely associated with Annie Besant, and he recited a poem which he had written around that time. And she herself was a trained musician, and she used to give performances. And she set a tune to that poem, and they all sang it together. It is a poem with 3 stanzas, and the first stanza was later adopted as the national anthem of India. Then the emblem of AWC, which shows a lady with a lady looking out of a window at a rising sun. That emblem is adapted from an installation at the Bose Institute, the famous institute set up by Sir J.C. Bose in Calcutta. And that itself is inspired by a painting by Nandalal Bose of Sister Nivedita. So we see that our associations run very far and very deep, and we are very proud to be part of this organization. And I am happy that our president, Mrs. Sheila Kakde, and Secretary General, Mrs. Kuljit Kaur, have joined us today. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining. And we have branches all across India, more than 600 branches, and more than 1 lakh voluntary workers, women voluntary workers as members. In Kerala and Karnataka, we have almost 40 branches, and we make up the South Zone B. I am the zonal organizer of South Zone B, and it is South Zone B plus the Trivandrum main branch of AWC that has been organizing these webinars under the Literary and Cultural Forum. Since Dr. Jamila is not, she has joined us, but I think she may not be able to speak to us. So I request Dr. Kamini to conduct the session and introduce the speaker. Dr. Kamini, over to you.
Thank you, Visha. Today's is the the 20th session of the Literary and the Cultural Forum. Let me first wish all of you a very good day. We have with us a very eminent academician and a professor who's our own daughter. What I mean is, she studied in Trivandrum and she did a PhD in the Department of English in Kerala University. And I think under Dr. Jamila Begum, isn't it?
Yes. No, yeah. I did it with Ayappa Panikar, okay, sir, but she was my teacher all along.
Okay, so you are our daughter, okay?
Yes, thank you.
So she teaches at the Department of English in Bangalore University. And after her PhD work on James Joyce and Marcel Proust from the Department of English, Kerala University, she worked as a resident scholar in the James Joyce Foundation, Zurich, Switzerland for a year. On her return to India, she worked as lecturer at the Center for Comparative Literature for 8 years and as a reader in the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies in the same university for 6 years before she joined the Department of English in Bangalore University. Her areas of interest span literary and cultural theory, translation studies, and Indian literatures. Of course, Joyce studies being her specialization, and she has translated and published 8 chapters of Joyce's Ulysses into Malayalam and continues to translate literary and critical text from Malayalam to English and vice versa. And she has been on a fellowship of the Department of Culture, Government of India for 2 years, and has been an associate fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. The last few years, as part of a research program sponsored by UGC, she has been consistently working on questions of identity and has published articles that offer an interdisciplinary perspective on literary text. And of course, she has been socially active on issues of gender and caste. So that's what I've been telling you. She's a very eminent professor. And today she's going to talk about courtesans and devadasis in modern Indian literature, community, sexuality, and nation. So I welcome you, ma'am, to today's session.
Yes, call me Chitra.
Okay. It's also my pleasure to welcome our President, our Secretary General, Kuljit Kaurji, and our President, Sheila Kaurji, and also the other members of AIWC. Of course, Usha Nair, who's the coordinator of South Zone B of AIWC, and of course our dearest Amma, that is Indra Ramakrishna Pillai. So welcome all of you. Over to you, Chitra. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening to all of you. I feel honored to be part of this program, and I thank Professor Jamila Begum for the invitation, and I also thank Mrs. Indra Pillai, President AIWC, who was in touch with me over this. My presentation is titled Courtesans and Devdasis in Modern Indian Literatures. And I would like to frame it along the context of community, sexuality, and nation. The courtesan culture, I suppose I'm audible?
Yes. Yeah.
The courtesan culture seems to have thrived in India for a long time, and we have very many references to it in ancient and medieval Indian literatures. To give a few instances, we have the Garnika character in the Kama Sutra. We have references to the courtesan in Kautilya's Arthashastra. We have references to courtesans in Buddhist texts written in the Pali language, especially the legends of Amrapali. Legends and perhaps hidden behind that a true story of Amrapali the courtesan, who was also the Nagaravadhu, because at that point in time, the courtesan was also declared the bride of the city, the bride of the city that she belongs to. And in Sanskrit texts like Nichakatika, we have references to the courtesan. Vasantasena is a very popular name among courtesans, among the courtesans of India. And we also have certain kinds of references in Tamil texts, like the character Madhavi, for example, in Chilapadikara. So I'm actually not referring to these many texts, and I'm going straight to modern Indian literatures, mainly because it was during the 19th century that the courtesan culture underwent a transformation in India. And the reflections of that you will see it recorded in modern Indian literatures. So that's why I'm actually choosing to speak on courtesans and devdasis who are depicted in modern Indian literatures. And I think the point 1857 is very crucial. When we try to study the history of courtesan culture in India, not only is it, the year of the Sepoy Mutiny or the first independence struggle of India, as we may prefer to call it, it is also the time when certain subcultures underwent huge transformations. And the courtesan culture was one of those cultures. As my launching pad, from modern Indian literatures, I'm actually taking the very famous novel by Ruswa, written in Urdu by Ruswa, called Umrao Jan Ada. And because it has been made into film many times over, it is also a very popular text. But I am actually taking the novel, which was initially written in Urdu. It was published in Urdu in 1899. And it was translated into English later by Kushwant Singh. So I am relying on Kushwant Singh's translation of Umrao Jan Ada. And what I'm trying to do there is to show how exactly in this text we have the recorded history of the transformation of the courtesan culture. I will take the first part of the novel and I will read a few lines from there. And when I read these lines, I think whoever is listening to me will also become conscious of the grandeur that was very much there in the depictions of the courtesan. Before Lucknow was sieged by the British powers. So I'm reading from the text. Many of you know already that it is a text which is written by Ruswa in the form of a memoir, and it is written in the first person as if Umrao Jan is talking about her own story. That's the way in which the text is written. And the text, even before the text begins, you will have Umrao talking to Ruswa. And Umrao says, "Who will listen to the tale of my woeful heart? Far and wide have I wandered, and I have much to impart." Which then incites Ruswa to make her tell him that story. And that's how the story begins. And in the first part of this Laknavi narrative, I call it the Laknavi narrative because it happens in Lucknow. There is the description of the grandeur of Khanum Jan's establishment, wherein is housed the courtesans of Lucknow. So I'll read a few lines from there for us to be conscious of the grandeur that is on display there in the Lucknow kotas, where the courtesans lived. I quote, "They were given furnished rooms of their own with white sheets spread on the floor and beds strung with tape to sleep on. They were given beauty cases full of cosmetics, enameled caskets to keep palm leaves, lime paste and betel nuts, and they had spittoons in the corners. The walls of their rooms were decorated with Syrian mirrors and beautiful paintings. Awnings were spread across the ceiling with small chandeliers in the center and globes on the sides. Each of the girls had a couple of maids and a couple of male servants constantly waiting on them. They began to receive men and have fun and laughter with them. They were like queens holding court, with young, handsome noblemen about them as courtiers to keep them counsel. They reclined on their couches and held the silver pipes of their hookahs to their mouths. Pan cases lay open in front of them. They rolled the leaves and handed them to their admirers with a lot of banter." Now, after that, you have the way in which the courtesan herself gets described. I quote, "When they rose from their couches, people praised Allah for their beauty. When they walked, people spread a carpet of admiring glances at their feet. These courtesans went about with their heads in the clouds and treated their admirers like slaves at their beck and call. These courtesans were like goddesses at whose altar worshippers brought themselves as offerings for sacrifice. And like goddesses, they treated everything with haughty disdain. Human lives were of no consequence to them." Now, unquote, and then I go to the last part of the novel. This is the first part of the novel. I go to the last part of the novel, and there the novel speaks of the same rooms. I suppose everybody is familiar with the Umrao Jan story because this is the room that she will revisit when she comes back to Lucknow after she is driven away from Lucknow by the British forces. And she has to live in Faizabad for a long time. And she comes back to Lucknow to visit that old kota. And this is what she sees there. I'll describe that. As is given in the text. I quote, "After seeing her," that is after seeing Kanu, who was running the kota, "I decided," it's written in first person, so it is I decided to go to my room and take out one of my nice dresses. When I opened the room, I saw cobwebs all around and dust piled high on the bed. The carpet and the sheets had been rolled up and there was litter on the floor. With pain, I recalled the scenes that had taken place in the same room. It was always beautifully done up. The bed which I used to sleep was so dirty now that I did not want to put even my foot on it." Unquote. This second description is emblematic of an establishment and a subculture that has been brought to penury, disrepute, and disuse over a period of time. And now we need to look at what had happened to Lucknow in the meantime, that things could have changed so much for its courtesan queens. I will now go for a quick recap of history for us to know what happened in the meantime. And if I go for that, it will read something like this. Lucknow was once the capital of the Muslim kingdom of Oudh. Awadh came into being in 1775. It was annexed by the British in 1856. In the same year, the court was disbanded and the King Wajid Ali Shah was dethroned. He was exiled in 1857, the year of the rebellion. So the year of the rebellion becomes very, very important for us to understand the transformation of the courtesan culture. The rebellion was suppressed in 1858 and vast changes were made in Lucknow city and its provincial government by the British, who ruled the region from 1858 to 1947. So we should also understand that at the time when the British attacked Lucknow, it was Wajid Ali Shah who was ruling over Lucknow, and he was already on the throne for nearly 9 years. And Wajid Ali Shah was a great patron of arts. He himself was a dancer and a singer and a composer, and there are lots of stories about him. And he was so much of an artist that Wajid Ali Shah has almost grown into a legend through history, and a great patron of arts. He is supposed to have had a large harem of singers and dancers. Talented Muslim and Hindu women who he patronized, married, contributed real estates to, etc. And keeping this in background, keeping this story in background, that is the fall of Lucknow, I argue that the fictionalization of the story of Lucknow in terms of the courtesan and her fall from grace is actually the story of Umrao Jan Ada. So I want to give the popular love story a clean historical perspective so that we get to understand why this novel is very important in the understanding of courtesan culture in India. So if we understand the novel as that, we also understand this text, Umrao Jan Ada, as a record, as a historical record. It records the days of the mutiny. It indicates a shift from monarchy to British rule and has references to the Uniform Code of Law. Umrao Jan declares, as part of the text, she declares, I had lived through the tragic days of the mutiny. So you have references within the text on the mutiny. And Ruswa's narrative further forwards and underlines the heterosexual matrix and makes Umrao remain apologetic about her position of no choice. She says, I quote, my life has fulfilled its sordid destiny, unquote. Now, there has been a great researcher on this called Veena Oldenburg, who worked on the Tawaifs in Lucknow and on the subculture of the which was propagated by the Tawaifs. And she has done much research on the Tawaifs of Lucknow, and she has a paper called The Lives, which is titled Lifestyle as Resistance. And here she mentions how the community's secret repertoire of bawdy songs, B-A-W-D-Y, bawdy songs, that is the tawaifs, the courtesans were called tawaifs. Yeah. And the repertoire of bawdy songs, mime and dance mocked even the institution of marriage. And the thankless toil of the regular housewife was mocked at. Male sexuality was mocked at. And also the repressive man-woman relationship, which was part of mainstream society at that point. She also records, that is, Oldenburg also records, how these courtesans sometimes practiced lesbianism without giving a name to it. It was not called lesbianism at that point in time. And according to her, in the quota, female sexuality got the chance of getting fearlessly constructed and also expressed. Now, it is possible to argue that it is this fearless expression of female sexuality which was inviting the growing resentment of the British towards this community. According to Oldenburg, the British maligned the culture of the salons to justify the usurpation of Awadh. And during colonial times, in British civic ledgers, these courtesans figured as singing and dancing girls. In British official memorandums, they were branded as carriers of sexually transmitted diseases. This is very interesting because I happened to read a book called Race, Sex and Empire, written by Kenneth Balhatchett. And this historical record gives a very interesting history of the British soldiers who were located in the cantonment areas in India during that time. What happened was they were not allowed to bring their families to India. And after the courtesans were driven away from Lucknow and their quotas plundered by the British, they were driven into what is now called red light areas of the many cities in India. And many of these red light areas were located very near the cantonment areas where these soldiers were. So the soldiers treated using these tawaifs and these trained artists as prostitutes. And the soldiers had come to India with diseases and they transmitted it to these women who they came into contact with. So the references in the British ledgers talking about the prostitutes carrying or these dancing girls transmitting disease is something which has to be taken with a pinch of salt if you would actually go to the real history where British soldiers located in the 110 cantonment areas all over the country was understood as afflicted with venereal diseases. And it may be remembered that during the plunder of 1857, the booty recovered, I'm just giving an idea of, in what state and grandeur these tawaifs led their lives. the booty recovered from Waji Ali Shah's harem amounted to 4 million rupees. And the courtesans were in the highest tax bracket, with the largest undivided incomes of any in the city. But the carnage that followed the plunder effected the impoverishment of the community and the ban on a profession, denying a community a profession as well as the expression of their art. And through a series of legislations and criminalization, and thereby deprivation of legitimate citizenship in the newly emerging India, the courtesans were totally marginalized. They were understood only as prostitutes from that time onwards. So we have instances of that. I was talking about this text Umrao Jan Ada as a text that we can first refer to because the author of the text was born in 1857. And this novel was published in 1899, one of the first novels to refer to courtesans in India. If we look at the Women Writing in India volumes, edited by Tharu and Lalita, we would see that they have expatiated on the South Indian counterpart of the courtesan. That is the Devdasi. So in the north, we had the Tawaips. In the south, we had Devdasis. And the story given by Tharu and Lalita, who have edited these volumes, that story is the story of the Devdasi Muddu Palani, who wrote a treatise called Radhika Santwana. See, now this is very interesting because many of these people did not write very much. They were great singers. They were also composers, many of these women. But they did not write about themselves. Muddu Palani is an exception because you have her releasing a text called Radhika Santwana. And at that point in time, when people like Bangalore Ratnamma were trying to publish it, that move was treated with a lot of suspicion, and the text itself was banned many times in colonial South India. Tharu and Lalita have conjectured on the expression of female sexuality, which was becoming increasingly monitored through allegations of obscenity and the consequent censorship of such texts in South India. I will extend it a bit further to say that eventually censorship fell on communities who enjoyed a subculture status before the British descended on them with their Victorian moral codes and a set of diseased soldiers. So we have actually traveled from the Tawaif culture in the north to the Devdasi culture in the south. I have also given you two specific instances of how it gets recorded in the literature of the time. There are people like Anil Chawla and Amrit Srinivas who have written on the Devdasi system in the south. They talk about how during the nationalist movement, this is very interesting again, during the nationalist movement, there were two clear groups in India working for and against the Devdasi tradition. British officials, Christian missionaries, social reformers of the time, and non-Brahmins on the one side. who used everything in their power to kill the Devdasi dance Sadir and their community of performers. So at that time, the dance practiced by the Devdasis, it was called Sadir, S-A-D-I-R. And these forces joined hands to kill the dance and also the community, destroy the community of performers of this dance. So the alliances were like that. On one side, you have these many people getting together. On the other side, you have European theosophists, the Congress, and the Brahmins, who tried to preserve and promote the dance as a national art form. In the hands of the latter, that is, in the hands of this alliance, that is, European theosophists, the Congress, the Brahmins, etc., Sadir emerged as Bharatanatyam. Helping the emergence of an elite class of amateur performers under the tutelage of Rukmini Devi Arunde, who was a Brahmin theosophist and who literally appropriated the Sadir dance form and standardized it to give rise to India's revered classical form of dance. So what did all this amount to? You know, when you appropriate a dance form, which would belong to a community in particular, and when you standardize it using text in order to propagate it as a national art form, what happens or what is the consequence of this ousting of a culture? It amounted to ousting the originators and stealing the patent in the name of cultural revivals. The politics around land, male assertions during this period, the questioning of community practices in the name of regional honor and national honor played a part in the slow death of the Devdasi institution. The irony, it seems to me, is that the British, who colluded with the local players to stop this immoral community practice in the name of reform, in the name of social reform, and in the name of the civilizing mission, actively encouraged prostitution in India, especially in and around the cantonment, as I told you earlier. So female sexuality seeking its own expression and wielding power was thus effectively controlled through legislation and the reform agenda, and in its place was put a powerless, unorganized system of prostitution that consolidated male power. Suddenly, it was as if this community did not have any power at all. It was all in the hands of men who were running the government, who were framing the laws, who were deciding how a community would live, what would happen to its art forms, who will practice it, etc., etc. So the net effect was sometimes a highly professional community practice getting transformed in certain cases into a lower caste practice of prostitution. For example, now in the south, in the Elampura village in Karnataka, Devdasis are found only among 3 scheduled caste communities. And which are these communities? The Holas, the Madhas or the Madigas, and the Sanghas. All over India, I'm sure there are local variants of this phenomenon, because it's not something which is restricted to a community. This happening It was something which affected the whole of India. Now, I have done just one text from modern Indian literatures. I have also selected a few other texts. This background history was very important for me to get into these texts and tell you how exactly the community formations can be traced in this text, and how life in these texts, life of the courtesans in these texts can be understood in relation to this background history. So I am first taking the novel called Seva Sadan, which was written by Premchand and published in 1918. So 1918, we should know, was the first phase of the nationalist movement in India. We all know that this novel has been made into a film in 1938, and it was none other than M.S. Subbulakshmi who played the lead role in this film. For me, it is very interesting that it came out during the national phase when Indian womanhood was being sold in terms of the chaste ideals it supposedly held. Because during the nationalist phase, it was very, very important to project a woman who was pure and chaste and who was Indian. So therefore, I also believe that Seva Sadan is not just a story where you have different characters. It's also a comment. It's a comment on women's marriage, on women's sexuality, on prostitution in India in the early 20th century, because the central character is a prostitute. One thing to be noted is that the Devdasi has already been reduced to the status of a prostitute. That's what I'm trying to say. When it comes to 1918, you really don't have the Devdasi. You have only the prostitute in her place. And Premchand's idealism is actually seeking ways to salvage this character from her profession and the ignominy of that profession, and reinstate her back into a respectable strata of society. The protagonist of the story is a woman called Suman. It's interesting that Suman is actually not from the Devdasi community. She is somebody who has lost everything, and therefore she has to meet a fate where she is driven to a prostitute house because of her circumstances, and where she learns from a Devdasi, the dance form, and she becomes a dancer. See, this is interesting because the tawaifs of erstwhile Benares have been identified by then as prostitutes. And their kotas have been identified as brothels. So Premchand's sympathy is with the prostitute character. My argument is that while Premchand does that, he actually misses out on a historical circumstance. The historical circumstance which reduced the tawaif to a prostitute. Premchand uses the instance to comment on the hypocrisy of a society which denies the prostitute a chance to reform herself. In the novel, there is an isolated reference to how during the British regime, the occupiers of the house in Benares get driven to the red light area in the city. Perhaps that is the only historical reference that is available in Premchand's Seva Sadan. Otherwise, it concentrates on the reinstating of the prostitute figure back into mainstream society. So it is part of the social reform agenda of the time. It is part of the nationalist agenda, and Premchand is actually being a party to it without being aware of the social circumstances of how exactly the Tawaif has been reduced to a prostitute. Now, I'm taking another text from around the same years, that is Devdas, another famous text, another popular text. It has been made into film thrice over, and so everybody knows everything about it. Written by Sharat Chandra, the Bengali writer, and published in 1917. And here the courtesan is, interestingly, is located in Calcutta, because that is where Devdas, the main character, meets Chandramukhi, the courtesan figure. He is led by his friend to Chandramukhi's house, where she, as a prostitute figure, entertains men from the nobility. How does she entertain them? With her dance and song. And let us remember, the time is once again 1900s, the first phase of nationalism in India. I'm not pursuing the Devdas Parvati love theme in the story, but I am trying to position Chandramukhi, the character, within the story. We will get to know that she doesn't enjoy a position akin to the erstwhile courtesan that she actually is. Because some of these Tawais were actually driven to Calcutta, and where they became prostitutes. Her place is that, in the novel, her place is that of a fallen woman, a prostitute. And in Devdas's mind as well, she is a prostitute. She is also a prostitute in the eyes of society. So Chandramukhi's art goes largely unappreciated in the wake of it, and her skills at entertainment, dance and music are scoffed at even by the more refined in her coterie of admirers, that is Devdas himself, who throws money at her. So there is a very important, very known Kathak dancer called Manjari Trivedi, who has talked about this throwing of coins that we see in films at the prostitute when she, at the courtesan when she dances. She says this is something which is not part of the courtesan culture at all, because she, as a Kathak dancer, went and studied the Tawaif culture in and around Lucknow. And she says, like we see in films, you really don't have the courtesans revealing their body, because they'll be dressed from head to toe. And they will actually seduce people only through their art. Whereas in films, as depicted in films, you see courtesans who reveal their body, who actually do the art of seduction through the movements and the revelation of the body. So these are all actually very interesting things to be remembered in the context of how the depiction is done in the novels of the time as well of the courtesan. And Chandramukhi is shown as being redeemed of her sin of prostitution through her pure love for Devdas, the purity of which Devdas himself is made to feel, because it is as against prostitutes' love. So Chandramukhi becomes important and significant only because of her devotion towards a single man and the purity of her love, as a result of which she actually goes to a Buddhist ashram and tries to live her life there, waiting for that moment when Devdas will return to her. So the social reformist agenda of the nation in early 20th century seems to fuse with the writer's commitment to be progressive. That is my argument. It is also noteworthy that Chandramukhi's lineage as a Tawaif is not traced by Sharat Chandra, the writer, at all. Though Devdas as a story is supposed to carry very strong autobiographical resonances in relation to Sharat Chandra's own life, where he was in love with a Tawaif. So that is the second novel that I want to place before you. And perhaps the third text is none other than Kumaran Ashan's Karuna, which all of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. And there, Karuna was published in 1923. Once again, during the nationalist phase. And Ashan's life was from 1873 to 1924. Karuna was published in 1923. Vasavadatta, the Devdasi, lives in splendor and glory, longing to receive Ubaguptan, the handsome monk, Buddhist monk, who she falls in love with. But Ashan has given a Buddhist twist to the tale and used the courtesan Vasavadatta to help Ubaguptan give her that last parting lesson on the ephemerality of sensory pleasure, visiting her at a point when she is rightfully punished for the crime of pursuing sexual pleasures. In the dunghill, severed of her bodily charms, her soul at last is ready to partake of a love that can be equated with compassion. So the art of the Devdasi is once again sacrificed at the altar of a higher philosophy, this time the Buddhist philosophy. So we don't get depictions of the grandeur of the courtesan in texts that were released in India between 1900 and 1950, 1947. That is very clear now. If you go to Ashan's poem, Khandakavya, in the initial part of the Kavya, you will see how beautifully she is described, Vasavadatta. The courtesan is described in all her grandeur. The mahal which she lives in is first described. Then her posture is described. The seductive posture which she sits in is described. And then those very famous lines, can I use some Malayalam?
Yes, maybe you could just give a translation after that.
Yeah.
Some of the people will not be able to follow Malayalam.
Yes, I just want to show in what grandeur, Vasavadatta is actually described by the poet Kumaran Ashan. Ramacha Vishari Paniniril Mukki Toriye Kondomal Kaivala Kilunge Ottu Vishichum Kanjabanan Tan Pattam Kettiya Ratnye Poloru Manjulangi Irikkunnu Madimohini. That is how Vasavadatta sits in her chamber. It says that, with special fans which are dipped in rose water, her maids are actually fanning her. And during that time, the bangles that she is wearing would make a sound which would fit the fanning, the rhythm of the fanning. And like the god of love's own queen, she sits there in all splendor and beauty, receiving this attention, from the maid. That's the way in which Ashan describes Vasavadatta. But look at the way in which the whole story is twisted, towards the end, where she becomes only an emblem of sexual pleasure. And she has to be redeemed of that. So there is no trace of that culture in the depiction at all. So in a way, the courtesan's art, the seductive power of her gestures and bearing is equated with a sensuality that is suggestive of a low form of existence. Though in terms of the grandeur of expression, Ashan excels in the description of the seductive bearing of Vasavadatta in the beginning of his kavya. This shifts to the description of the inner peace she gets at the hour of her meeting with the handsome monk Upagupta, who she waits for till the end of her life, but who doesn't visit her at all, saying that it's not yet time. It's not yet time. That becomes a refrain in Ashan's text. So these three texts are actually texts which can be confined to the 1857 to 1947 phase. There is another text which I want to refer to, that is the Dalit writer's text. Baburao Bagul, the Marathi writer, has written a text called Soodh. Soodh means revenge. And there Janaki, the daughter of a Devdasi, finally seeks to destroy her femaleness as the only way to escape being degraded by men, by offering her female body to the river Ganga. Here I see a very different kind of depiction, because we should also understand that this text was published in 1970, many years after independence. And therefore, that date is very significant because it was also the rise of Dalit writing, the 1970s. The Dalit movement was happening. There was Dalit writing. At that point, somebody who is identified with the Dalit movement in Marathi is writing a novel with the prostitute as the central character. So at the height of the Dalit movement, to have a text like this, what does it mean? It means that the Devdasi community is identified at that point in relation to a caste. That prostitution in post-independence India gets more and more identified with scheduled caste communities. This is a point which I earlier mentioned, is clear from Bagul's depiction of the Devdasi. And the extreme measure which Janaki seeks towards the end, that is killing herself, is the only way in which she can counter the ill treatment from this society. Now, from this point, I would actually go back to some of the filmic depictions of the Devdasi. I want to talk about how the representations of the courtesan and the Devdasi in Indian films have been stripped of this national context altogether. There is no national context there. And there is no politics which is depicted there around either community or sexuality. In films, both courtesans and Devdasis emerged as the beautiful, exotic, talented singers and dancers, just individual figures. They are not linked to a community at all. And they exude and exhibit a vibrant and seductive form of female sexuality. A figure which is tragic, which is enigmatic, which is more sinned against than sinning. And often enough, these depictions were also attempts to salvage the image of the impure woman, which the nationalist drive had reduced her to, purifying her, not by reinstating her back in society, but through the vital experience of an all-purifying, self-sacrificing true love extended towards just one man. You see this pattern in all the films. Devdas, I'll give you instances. Devdas, Pakisa, Umrao Jan. In Devdas, Chandramukhi, in the experience of an all-consuming life, surrendering love for Devdas, transforms herself entirely, gives up her profession, her comforts, and goes for an ethical transformation to be able to wait for her true love, Devdas. Pakisa may not tell a different story except that the wait was less futile in Pakisa. In Umrao Jan, the courtesan's love for the Nawab shows itself only in the form of a felt emotion divulged through the subtle gestures of the Kathak dance and some songs, of course. But the future reality of these imaginaries are contained in the constricted lives of isolated women in a later film, which came much after independence, in a film which talked about the isolated women in the brothel house of Mandi. There was a film called Mandi with, I think very important actors there. Playing.
Smita Patil.
Yeah, Smita Patil. Smita Patil and Shabana Azmi, I think. Shabana Azmi was playing the role of the mistress of the brothel house. So after reviewing all this, I just want to say that I would like to step aside a little and review the scene of transitions of a subculture governed by colonial forces and post-colonial conditions in terms of appropriations and representations. I would like to do this by revisiting the multiple frames that are available to us from the grid of feminist theory itself. That it is a women's community that has been subjected to the vagaries of colonial history, and that it is the agency of the eminently talented individual women artists in that community that face the reduction of status and agency during a period in the history of the nation is something which will help us understand the whole story of the Tawaives and the Devdasis in relation to a feminist understanding of the subject. Because even if you go back to, the Tawaif culture, we will know that people like, very important artists of the time, Gawar Jahan and Begum Akhtar, they were all products of the courtesan culture. And it is written about Gawar Jahan as to how she used to drive on the streets of Calcutta in a carriage driven by 6 horses. And the British official thought it was a British lady who was traveling on the carriage and doffed his hat. She doffed hers in return. And when he went back to the office and asked about who exactly that was, this wonderful woman who was stealing the attention of the Calcutta city itself, they told him that it is none other than Gawab Jahan, the courtesan. So the British decided that since only British officials and British ladies were supposed to travel on these carriages, they will levy a tax on her of 3,000 rupees. And 3,000 rupees at that time was a huge sum of money. And she just walked into the British officers, British officers of British officials' office and gave the fine and said that I'm paying the fine for traveling by carriage. So this was the kind of, culture that the courtesan had, and the courtesan was associated with the Tawaifs especially. And Kathak dance was actually their contribution to culture. Not only Kathak dance, you have items like Tumri and Ghazal and all that, which were perfected by the Tawaifs. It was later appropriated by other people and used. Even men like Briju Maharaj, who were called Ustads in the realm of Kathak dance. But these were all produced by women at that point in time. Now, that also makes us wonder as to how this appropriation has not met with enough attention, mainly because of the erasures of history. We have come to believe that there is this Kathak dance, which is part of our national culture, which we can be very proud of. There is this Bharatanatyam dance, classical dance, which we can exhibit as a product of national culture, Indian national culture. But what about the forms that were appropriated? And what about these communities which have been deprived of the patent that they held on these art forms? So these are questions which, interestingly enough, were also answered by some of the literary texts later. I'll refer to just two texts. If you would remember, there was this text by Mahesh Dattani, the writer, which is titled Dance Like a Man. And there, Mahesh Dattani talks about Ratna, that is the main character, main dancer character in the text, going and learning the art form from a Devdas and learning it in its pristine form, that is in the form of Sadir, in the form of Dasi art. And when she comes back, her husband would ask her, why are you going there and learning this? And she says, that is where it all originated. Actually, she is the one who knows the form. And I think that woman character is called Chenni Amma, that is the Devdas. And Ratna goes and learns the dance. Ratna, who is a Bharatanatyam dancer, who is in search of the origins of this dance form, will go to Chenni Amma and learned this dance. And when she is questioned by her husband, that's when she gives the history of the dance. So there have been conscious attempts by writers, but in very recent times, to rewrite this history, this forgotten history, through fiction. And Mahesh Dattani's Dance Like a Man is one of the initial texts which had attempted that. I will perhaps close this session but with reference to one other text which I read very recently. This is a novel. This is a novel which is written by none other than the dancer Srividya Natarajan, who is now located in Canada, but who has learned Bharatanatyam from Kittappa Pillai, who belongs to the lineage of Devdasis. She has learned it for 30 years and she is a practicing dancer. And she, when she was a research student at the University of Hyderabad, she wrote a thesis on this. And that thesis was Talking to the Nation, or Talking Back to the Nation, I think. She titled it thus, where she talked about this dance form, Sadir. And she talks about a community of dancers and their art form, which has been forgotten by history. I'm referring to this novel, which I read very recently, this novel by Srividya Natarajan. And the title of the novel is The Undoing Dance. This was published in 2018. And it is the enthralling story of the rise and fall of a family of women dedicated to dance and music. The family of women referred to are the Devdasis in the south. And the storyteller, as I told you, is Srividya Natarajan, a gifted dancer herself, who learned from the Bharatanatyam guru Kittappa Pillai, who belongs to the lineage of Devdasis. And this novel, interestingly, is also a critique of the world of Bharatanatyam dance, its politics and its social milieu. And Srividya's text is a fictionalization of the story of the Devdasi, who 13 generations ago was celebrated as the artist in India, and who now is shunned as a prostitute. That is in modern India. The character that she concentrates on is Kalyani. Kalyani, a very young dancer. Her protagonist, who dances in the author's own language like light on a river, and is forced to keep her origins as a descendant of the Devdasi community hidden. Because if she reveals that she is from the Devdasi community, she will not have any standing in society. So she keeps it hidden, and then she seeks comfort in the life and recognition that she can get from art, A with a capital letter. So Kalyani's mother is Rajai, and Kalyani learns this dance form from her mother, who is a Devdasi. And I'm tempted to quote from the novel, the ending of the novel, taking my words from Rajai's mouth, and I will close the session with that. Rajai, the Devdasi dancer, she says, I quote, "I see a road stretching backwards, the women standing along it at regular intervals, like telephone poles, like milestones, like lights in a railway tunnel. A punctuation of women, my ancestor at the head of it. Anna Kali Nachiyar, who made stone rise up in the air like a feather. What I sing is a fragment. It is tiny because my memory has failed, but it is also precious, priceless, because it is what remains of that glory of those women who stood with their hands on their hips, balanced lightly and insolently on one leg, the other leg flowing slightly away from the body, carrying the curve of waist into the earth. And behind those proud women, the door stretched until it disappeared into the sky. Unquote. So I think I'll stop my examination here of these many texts. And if there are any questions, I'll only be happy to answer them, because many of these things could not be talked about since I was racing through these many texts and points which I thought were relevant for an exposition of the fall of a community over the years.
Thank you, Chitra. It was beautiful. It was just wonderful to listen to you, It was very nice. Thank you. Any questions? Any doubts?
Questions, clarifications, anything is welcome.
I wanted to tell you that I've read that M.S. Subbulakshmi's mother was a Devdasi.
Yes. Actually, it's very interesting, and I think musicians like T.M. Krishna have also talked about it.
Yeah.
Because that part of M.S. Subbulakshmi remains hidden, that she belonged to the Devdasi community, and now she becomes an icon of the Brahmin caste, in a way.
Yes.
Because she is the iconic image of Brahminhood, South Indian Brahminhood. And that is the image which actually gets acceptance.
Because in her younger age, she had the atmosphere to learn
Dance and music.
Wonderful.
As part of the household inheritance, actually.
No.
Chitra, what about Vaijayanti Mala? I read somewhere that she also belonged to this tradition, the Devdasi.
Yeah, but they were
Karnataka. She's basically from Karnataka.
Yeah, but they were all coached in the Bharatanatyam style. By then, Sadir had actually, disappeared. Sadir, the original form, had disappeared. And so she was coached in the Rukmini Devi Arundel tradition of Bharatanatyam. I have seen her performances by Jayanti Malak, and it is a standard Bharatanatyam performance.
Okay.
You don't actually see, remnants of the Devdasi tradition there, or the Dasi Atam there, because she has got it in a standardized form. If you go to contemporary dancers, if you would want to see Dasi Atam getting performed, you will have to see performances by people like Nritya Pillai, because she is very conscious of her inheritance from the Devdasi tradition. And she also keeps reminding her audience that what I'm doing here is not the standardized form. I'm doing the form which I have inherited from my family.
Okay, thank you. Anybody wants to interact?
Yeah, I can ask about Bala Saraswati.
Yes, Bala Saraswati, actually, if you see her dance, you know that she has come from a lineage because it is so natural and vibrant. And her dance has always been equated with something that was slightly different from standardized forms of dance.
Yes.
You have mentioned North Indian writers. How about people like Subramanya Bharati? How did they view the situation?
No, they did not write texts with, the courtesan as the protagonist. I was only examining texts like that.
Anybody wants to interact?
Kuljit, you want something?
This is Manjula Ghosh from Calcutta. I
Yeah,
want to tell Chitra
Yeah.
that when
Yeah.
Wazir Ali Shah came from Lucknow to Calcutta, after British
Calcutta. I remember.
British took hold of Oudh,
Yes.
he and his all his people stayed in Metiaburuj in Kolkata.
Yes, he was
And-
exiled. He was exiled to Calcutta.
Yes,
He was exiled to Calcutta.
He
Yeah.
stayed in Metiaburuj. His family and all his people
Yes.
stayed in Metiaburuj, part of Calcutta.
Yes.
And all the dancers also, they stayed in Calcutta. They stayed in Bowbazar area.
Actually, that is how the Tawaif culture spread in Calcutta.
Yes, yes.
In-
In the
It's like
Bowbazar
they
area,
just-
they made a quota.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
They lived in a traditional quota also because the British had given very generous grants to Wajid Ali Shah
Yes.
just to be away from the scene.
That Wazid Ali Shah culture also came to Calcutta. He
Yes.
entered that culture to Calcutta also.
Yes. So the
And another-
Calcutta courtesans were always referred to as Tawaifs.
Yes. And another thing I want to tell you is Sharat Chandra wrote a book, autobiography, Srikanta,
Yes.
where his actual love is Rajalakshmi, who was a courtesan also.
Yes,
Who was a
many,
courtesan.
for many of these writers, actually, if you look at Mirza Ghalib, you know,
Yes.
he spent all his life in the company of a Tawaif,
Mhm.
Ghalib, the poet. And for many of these poets,
That was her inspiration.
their Tawaifs were actually people who they would be highly conversant with. And they were the muses.
Yes.
They were
And
the,
also I want to tell you that poet Rabindranath Tagore wrote a poem on Shanyashi Upagupta, that the dancer Bashav Datta waited for him. And
Okay.
Shanyashi came when Bashav Datta was suffering from smallpox.
okay.
At that time, Shanyashi Upagupta said, "This is the right time for me to come to you."
Okay. True. That's how it happened in the real story also. Except that it was not smallpox.
But thank you for your excellent speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
Thank you so much, Chitra ji. It was a very informative. You have changed the whole perception. And Wajid Ali, I mean, the way they had depicted him in the Shatranj Ke Khilari, it was very different from what you have said.
Yes, yes.
I mean, how these Britishers, they have exploited us of our culture, of the grandeur, the way you have explained about the first chapter of Umrao Jan and the last one.
And also the status of women as a whole.
Yes.
You know, how it has been reduced to that of people who are cringing and serving others from a grandeur and independence that they enjoyed some time ago. Actually, at that point, I think women had choices. Women in that community had choices. Later, they were reduced to a community which did not have any choice.
They have killed our art, no, in that way, and brought their own things to our country.
Yes.
Now we believe in their dance and we forget about our own culture.
Yes.
Because they have ruined everything and destroyed everything. They have changed their perception about our history, about art and culture.
Yes.
Thank you so much for enlightening us for all these things, because we don't go to the background and we always look down upon the prostitution.
Yes.
Because recently we are discussing whether we should be legalized or not legalized. Actually, we should be sympathetic in the way they have been treated and where they have been downgraded.
Yes.
Since they have fallen from that culture. Don, thank you so much for giving such a details about the life of this courtesan and how it has been brought down to a prostitution. Thank you so much. I think I'll read all these books which you have mentioned.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the patient listening.
Oh, it was so interesting. We didn't feel the time.
Yes, very true. Very true.
Thank you, Usha, for arranging this program.
Thank
I
you
thought-
for
I
joining.
thought it was going to be very interesting. I told you in the morning itself.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Usha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maitli.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Chitra,
Yes,
as
thank you, Chitra.
Chief mentioned, you have totally changed our perspective, because now when we see the Bharatanatyam or Kathak, we will
Yes.
remember the legacy behind these dance forms and how things have been transformed. Actually, at least I never looked at it this way. Though we have read about all this, but then, connecting history and the transformation of the Tawaives and Devadasis into prostitutes, you did it in a very clear and beautiful way. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. Thank you so much.
Excellent it was, Chitra ji.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think, shall I read some messages in the chat box?
Yeah, in the chat box.
From Chitra to everyone. Thank you, Chitra Panikkar. Very informative, interesting talk. Enjoyed. I had seen only films you mentioned, and of course, our sons. Aruna only touched with this topic. Lakshmi Bhan has said very interesting insights on the life of courtesans. Thank you. Kalyani Raj has mentioned that thank you, Chitra, for the collaboration. Very interesting. Nisha Venugopal has said very interesting talk, Chitra. So very, very interesting anyway. We didn't know the time passed by.
Kamini, can I just come in for a moment?
Sure, sure.
Kalyani. Yeah. Chitra, I was just I was just trying to remember at that point of time, but two things sort of struck me. One, what you mentioned that in earlier days, the Devadasis were centering around where the British cantonment was. British cantonment, like wherever the army people were there, and this was located. And I'm able to link it now to the places I have seen this, like, in Delhi and Calcutta, in both these places, I have seen this concentration wherever near earlier there was British, armed forces, settlement. Yeah. So that's a very interesting thing which you have mentioned and which I'm able to sort of link now. And the second thing I was thinking, which you mentioned about the dress aspect, like earlier they were dressed from top covered from top to bottom, and then now, so in that respect, somehow, I don't know, this is my idea, that probably media and the commercialization of the whole thing has played a big role into changing this.
It definitely has, because you ask any Kathak dancer and how exactly these courtesans were dressed, Tawaives were dressed, who have gone into the history, they'll tell you that, there was nothing revealing about
Absolutely.
it. And not only that, it was part of their training. They were not supposed to reveal their body.
Reveal anything.
Actually,
that we can make out even in the movies. When you see the old movies, when you talked about Umrao Jawan, look at the way Rekha dressed at that time, and look at the way any other scenes are, like, given in current any of the recent movies about Tawaif or anything. I think one recently I saw Kalank. There again, there are two things which what you spoke, where I was sort of linking with that movie. One, Alia Bhatt goes to learn music to this kotha because she listens to that music and she says that is the original classical music. So when you were talking about how people used to go to the kotas for learning, Ratna, you mentioned, how she went. So then I was just trying to think, because that is what is reflected in that movie, that Alia Bhatt goes to that place to learn. And the way Kalank mein, how they have shown the dancers, it's so much different from what it was being shown earlier in Pakizas or, Umraos. So this I think that the media and the movie and the Hollywood, all this has changed these perceptions a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much.
And Chitra, there is another message also. from Jani. Sorry, I missed the main part. I could join very late, but from what I heard, it was very interesting. Thank you so much.
I have one question.
Yes.
Actually, you talked about Kathak and Bharatanatyam.
Yes.
But what about our own Kerala thing, Mohiniyattam? That has got some link to it, or
No, not a major link actually, but it has also undergone some transformation, I think, over the years. It has undergone some transformation, but not to the extent that Bharatanatyam has undergone. Mohiniyattam never became a dance form which was actually projected as a national art form. It always stayed within Kerala.
I think it had to do with the royalty part, right? Mohiniyattam, little bit it had to do with the royalty, right?
Yeah, also it was identified as the enchantress dance and all that earlier. Later, there was a little bit of standardization happening there. So
last year used to be the okay. That's what I mean. And also, I was waiting to hear about Devdas. Whenever you were saying Devdasis, I was thinking you're going to come out with Devdas and Paru.
No, I didn't want to talk about Paru and Devdas because I thought that Parvati Devda's story was inconsequential to our argument as a whole. So that's why I left it.
Okay. You're talking about Chandramukhi. No?
Yes.
That's what okay. It was really interesting and a lot of new things, we could understand.
Okay. In Devdas movie where Vajantimala was Chandramukhi, there's this point that she was the heroine of the movie and not the Suchitra Sen.
Actually, Devdas was done many times over in the form of a film.
Yes.
And not around Paru.
I think Dilip Kumar was a hero, isn't it?
Sorry?
Dilip Kumar.
No, Dilip Kumar was there, but Chandramukhi, she said, I should be called the heroine of the movie because the movie is around my life and not around the life of Paru.
Oh, really?
That's what Vajantimala said. I should be taken as the heroine of the movie.
Okay.
When that Devdas came. No?
Okay.
Of course, later on they showed.
Later on. Yeah, that was Aishwarya Rai and
all show business. There was
Madhuri Dixit.
Madhuri Dixit was Chandramukhi in the later version. Yeah.
And of course, Shah Rukh Khan.
Okay, anybody else who wants to interact? Shall we close it? Usha?
I think we can close the session if there are no more questions or comments.
I was just thinking another thing. Whenever you're talking about Umrajan, the problem is that after seeing all these movies, you only think of Rekha as Umrajan. That's what I was happening. Whenever you're talking, I was just focusing on that, the way she was dressed and the song. And
I think Aishwarya Rai also has acted as Umrajan.
But I was always thinking of Rekha's the grandeur and all. I just visualizing that.
Yeah, that is what I meant when I said that perspectives have changed because the Umrao Jan, what we know about Umrao Jan is mainly based on the movie.
Yeah, I know.
Mainly based on the movie.
And then all the songs and dance and everything.
Yeah, I was taking you back to where it all originated.
Yes. So now we know the background.
Now we know.
We would like to go back and go through these novels and texts, just to understand what this is. We were only seeing the superficial face of this.
Not that Indian history and, that British legacy.
How whole culture was destroyed systematically and how this can happen. Actually, it can happen anytime, anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not something that has
happened. And we can be totally oblivious of that.
Yes. We don't realize that it is happening while it is happening. That is the problem.
So as always, our this forum has really come up with a good subject, enlightening.
Very interesting and very different subject.
Very beautiful.
Hatke, they call it, no? Hatke.
Once again, I thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be with you, and enjoyed this session. Enjoyed sharing with you whatever little I have done on the subject. Thank you very much.
It was a very enjoyable session, and we learned a lot from this. And we hope that you will stay connected with AWC. We would.
Yeah, please let me know your programs. I'll definitely be a participant.
Yes, and we'll be again, contacting you. We have many branches in Bangalore.
Right.
So we'll be in touch with you, and I hope you will remain associated with our organization.
I'd love to, definitely.
Thank you so much. Actually, Dr. Jamila had joined for some time, and maybe because of the huge time difference, she has left.
It would be difficult for her, I think.
Yes, it is very odd time for her. But I'll be sending her the YouTube link. She'll watch it certainly.
Right.
And I thank Jamila for maintaining this literary and cultural forum, because she has been the mainstay of the whole thing. She has been away for 3 months, but we have somehow managed to continue the tradition, and she'll be back next month, I think. So we hope to see her at the next session. So shall we wind up now?
Yes, thank you.
I thank all of you for joining and for remaining with us for the whole length of the lecture and the discussions. And as you all have already mentioned, we hardly realized the passage of time because the talk was so interesting. So thank you, Chitra, and thank you to each and every one of you for joining and spending an enjoyable evening with us. Thank you, Kuljeet, especially for joining, and it was actually your suggestion that made us shift it to Saturday. So we hope that more people will find it convenient to join now.
So much. It
Thank
used
you.
to be Thursday and so difficult to attend.
Working days, many people express that it is difficult. So now we'll try to keep it on Saturdays.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. And now we'll end the session here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.